is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He told me my Tales from the Loop aren't the same kind of Tales from the Loops we're going to be talking about today. Stu Horvath.
Yeah, one's a bar, one's a 80s that never was. There's still not that much distinction between the bar and the game.
Yeah, there isn't much distinction between the 80s bar and the 80s game, although the 80s bar has a lot of stories that I just can't tell on a family-friendly program. How you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good. How are you?
You know, I can't complain. So today we're talking about Tales from the Loop.
Yay.
Which is something that we've talked about on a lot of other episodes in the first year we did the show, but we never actually devoted an entire episode to Tales from the Loop itself. So I'm super excited to talk about this game.
Yeah, man. The first thing I have to say is that, Tales from the Loop is built on 80s nostalgia, and we played 2 sessions of it, and I never quite got back around to running it again. And I have such profound nostalgia for those 2 games, and I think that that's really deeply ironic, and I want to fix that at some point. I just love this game so much. I had so much fun running it. I feel like everybody had fun playing it. We had people playing it who weren't normally in the role-playing game rotation playing it. It was something else, man.
It is such a well-written game, and I think at that point we had been playing Dungeons & Dragons together for so long, it felt like such a fresh, refreshing kind of experience. Like when you're outside on a hot day and you get that ice-cold soda pop and you're like, why don't I just drink this all the time? It's so good. But in that moment, it's just really the best. And that was those 2 sessions. And I agree. I don't know that we've ever had a session like that again.
No, as Tales from the Loop so beautifully expresses, the adult world gets in the way, and now the whole world has changed. So I don't know when we're ever going to be able to get around a table again.
Hopefully we will find our way back to that magical place. So in the meantime, let's tell our listeners about that magical place.
Yeah, so Tales from the Loop is a game set in the 80s that never were. The idea that in the 40s and 50s there were a series of scientific advancements that did not happen in the real world, one of which was the building of a gigantic particle accelerator called the Loop. You have 2 potential settings detailed in the rulebook, one in Sweden, one in Boulder, Colorado, but there's nothing stopping you from building a loop wherever you live, which is exactly what I did. So we had the North Jersey loop.
Yeah, we did. It was awesome because for anyone who's listening to this who grew up in New Jersey, there was the old ITT Tower on the border of Nutley and Clifton.
Yep.
And it was torn down so many years ago, and they built a Target in its place, which, arguably I think was a better move. However, in Stu's story, there was the Jersey Loop where the old ITT Tower was.
Both that, the ITT complex, and the Hoffman-LaRoche complex, I feel like they had that vibe already of the Loop facility. And then there was also those weird things. I think it was mostly ITT. They had radio testers and stuff in a field somewhere. That big arch thing that had the same character. And I'm sure that wherever you live, there's something like that where you could tie the Loop to it. So the Loop is this giant particle accelerator. The book is sort of squirrely about what actually happens there, of course, because it's the big mystery. But there's also advances in robotics and what they call magnetron ships, which use the Earth's magnetic field to fly. So there's big air barges that carry freight, that would otherwise have been in the water. And all of those things had great promise in the 60s and 70s. And by the 80s, everybody's sort of a little bit disillusioned with them. So there's rusting robots and magnetron ships are in the harbor sunk. There's an idea that all of the promise has passed. And you play kids. It's a kid adventure game.
I love a kid adventure game.
Yeah, so there's all this weird science and technology laying around, and you sort of investigate mysteries that crop up because of it. So there's time travel stuff, there's dinosaurs, time portals, robots. The one we did had mind-controlled birds. They all had chips in them.
Yeah. Oh, such a good time.
Yeah, it's great. And then the idea is that you live in this fantastical world of mystery and danger, but at the same time, you have to balance that against your boring, mundane angsty kid life, like your home life, dealing with parents, dealing with school, dealing with bullies, all that stuff. And as much as like one thing seems obviously more interesting than the other, it's the tension between those two things that I think really makes the game come alive, because it's a realer sort of nostalgia. When we look back on the 80s, we tend to just focus on like the fun stuff, like the cartoons and the TV shows and the toys and maybe the music and such. But we were kids and we're developing, and school sucks, and you have issues. And I think that like just by introducing the potential for that kind of storytelling, it grounds the game in a really unique way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think as a role player, it really does afford you the ability to let your guard down and really give yourself over to the game and to be a part of the game. Because listen, most people, and I don't feel like this is a broad generalization, but I will tell you, I've never met a person who's actually met a dragon in real life. However, I know plenty of people who lived through the 80s. I know plenty of people who lived through the 70s and 60s, going back to the 50s and earlier, where there was the promise for technology. There was the promise for great change and revitalization and things that never really came to be. Where, when you listen to the stories of your grandparents and your elders and other people that have come in and out of your life, it's not hard to imagine yourself in those places. Whereas I don't know that I will ever see the business side of a gelatinous cube, and God, I hope I don't. So I really found that the experience was, especially because we did have a bunch of people playing with us in that session who never opened up a role-playing book or rolled dice before, and they were able to just really get right into it and just have fun.
Yeah, so the system is super simple to run and play. It's all based off of the Mutant Year Zero system, which Fria Ligan has used in other games too. And it's just a super simple skills system. Anybody can get it after a couple seconds, and then you just worry about the world and what you want to do. And I think that that's amplified by the fact that, we played D&D for so long, and D&D's fun in its way, but like there's no grounding in it. And then we moved on to Cthulhu, and then I loved it when we first played those first couple Cthulhu sessions, because like once you realize you're in the real world and it works in a way that's similar to this world, there's like less baggage. And that's even more so with Tales from the Loop, because it's really a world we recognize. The main difference is that like it's more of an analog world as opposed to like the digital one we live in now. But like it's very recognizable. Cars look like cars. Phones work like phones. And I think that there's just like less barrier to entry. And there's so many 80s movies that even if you didn't personally experience the 80s in some form, you've gotten it through movies, and that'll inform you enough to kind of imprint your own personal experiences with like an 80s vibe. And I think all of that is just done really well and just implemented really well. And it all makes the overall experience of the game easy for anybody to get into and enjoy and get immersed in.
It's one of the lowest barriers to entry of any RPG I've ever played.
Yeah, and this is the most complex story game, I feel like. Story games are easier to like play, but like this is more of like a traditional role-playing game with dice, and it's recognizable to somebody who plays D&D. It's like right in the middle, and it's just so well realized. A lot of that is down to Simon Stålenhg's art.
Oh, yes. Yes.
The whole world is Simon's, and it's so well realized. He's got such control over the light in his pictures. Childhood is a fleeting thing, and nostalgia at its core is a sadness for a thing that is gone and no longer attainable, right?
True story.
And the game has that sadness already, but then Stålenhg's art ties the sadness of not being able to go back to your childhood, the sadness of all the troubles that you have in your childhood, with the overall loss of potential from all this technological innovation that was misused or never fully understood properly. So like there's all this lost potential and sadness in the world. And I'm a goth kid, so like I find this really good. It's really nice. It has like, it just like hits these melancholy notes that I just really love.
Look, I love you for owning it. Yeah.
Like, people think I'm joking when I'm just like, I don't like comedy. They're just like, really? You don't like comedy? And it's like, if it's not sad, I'm not interested.
Yeah, I'll be very honest with you, dear listener. If you find it in you to make Stu laugh, it is a hard-earned, well-rewarded laugh, because he doesn't like comedy.
I don't. Silliness is just like, why bother with silly? There's serious stuff we could talk about, you know?
I will say, though, I did fall in love with the art first. I think you had the art books before you actually got the game itself.
I did,
and
yep.
I remember sitting around the clubhouse one night, and we were just passing around the books before we played games, and I was like floored by the art and the way it made me feel. I think your description of it was spot on. I'll also add on to that, there is a certain optimism to it as well, because, you know, when you do see some of the younger people in that artwork, they are in it, they're living it, and they're on that adventure in real time in those pictures. So you kind of see the full spectrum of emotion in the art. And I was like, if I could play a game where that is in there, I'm sold American. And I'm so glad I did. And Simon Stålenhag's art is breathtaking.
Yeah. And you're right. The other side of the coin, like I focus on the sad part, but the other side of the coin is childhood is all about potential going forward. Like you have the rest of your life and all of your potential accomplishments ahead of you. That's the irony of childhood, right? What kid doesn't want to be an adult? Like you're always chafing at the rules that you have to follow and the stuff that adults are free of. And like every kid fantasizes about being an adult. There's a promise in adulthood that you're reaching for in Tales from the Loop that's really appealing too, especially as an adult who's having a hard time finding time to run role-playing games, right?
Yeah. If I knew then what I know now, I would have been like, yo, can I just park it at 19? We'll just call it a day there. Can I just keep my dirtbag job at the supermarket, keep, you know, riding my bike places and driving the car when I have to, and like hanging out with my friends and playing in a band? Because shit, I hate paying taxes.
Yo, that tropical storm we had a couple weeks back, that basically knocked down my chimney. I had to get my chimney replaced. Like, what? I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah. I just wanted to be older so I could afford to buy more games. This is bullshit.
I wanted to be older so that we could just like not have to go to school so we could play more games.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the thing about Tales from the Loop. It hits all of these notes, and all of these notes are really like intertwined together in the game, in the mechanics, in the setting, and in the players. Like I think that it's just natural for everybody to kind of feel that resonance, and I just think that it all works really well. And you can kind of see why Tales from the Loop works so well in comparing it to Things from the Flood, and how that game, for me at least, doesn't work as well because it's the sequel book that's set in the 90s when you're teenagers and you could die. And like bad things can happen. And it's a lot more angsty, and it moves the balance between the mysteries that are so entrancing to the personal life. The needle starts going towards the personal stuff, and there's like romantic entanglements and just a lot more angst. Now, granted, like that's when I was a teenager, so like it should have appealed, but there's less promise and a lot more hardship. You know, games are multiple systems that interact, right? Tales from the Loop is like multiple emotional systems that interact. And Tales from the Loop, they're super well balanced. And I feel like in Things from the Flood, you start to see how balanced Tales of the Loop is, because this doesn't feel right. It doesn't come to life the same way. It doesn't hit those notes in the perfect way that Tales from the Loop does.
Well, you know, I look at Tales from the Loop the same way I look at the movie Goonies. Like, you know, Goonies never say die, and no one actually does in this movie. So it's cool. It's a good, like, kid adventure. Things from the Flood, well, someone might show up, and not all of you are going to walk out of here. So it's a very, very different kind of vibe.
Yeah, like what's that movie with Crispin Glover where they find the body by the river?
River's Edge?
River's Edge, yeah. Like Things from the Flood is River's Edge.
Yeah.
You know? Like they're teenagers in that, right?
Yeah, they are.
And that's cool. That's a good vibe, but it's not a vibe that's magical like Tales from the Loop.
There's no whimsy in Things from the Flood.
Yeah. And it's just darker. And you would think that I would like that more. But it doesn't work for me as much. Tales from the Loop is a perfect game. I can think of so few things to criticize about it. Like maybe your characters are tied to templates, and maybe that's a little bit limiting. And like it's sort of a white game. It's very white. But like that's just a side effect of it being developed in Sweden. Like it's very easy to make it less white. And I feel like it gets compared a lot to Stranger Things, and I think that's unfair.
I agree.
Because I think it's so much better than Stranger Things. Like, not better, but like it's just a broader potential experience. Because Stranger Things is just one thing, and it's one set of kids, and Tales from the Loop is like all kids.
I agree. I think the reason why it gets lumped in with Stranger Things is because Stranger Things, for all intents and purposes, is an homage to Amblin Entertainment.
Yeah.
And this is Amblin Entertainment, the RPG.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, not a fully fair comparison because I do love Stranger Things. However, I could imagine what a Stranger Things RPG would play like, and it's not going to play, and it's not going to feel as good as Tales from the Loop.
Yeah. Stranger Things is very concerned with referencing the 80s in a way that gives you like a little bit of a dopamine hit, right?
Exactly.
Whereas like Tales from the Loop isn't concerned with that. Like that's the setting, and like music does play a big part. Like each character gets to pick a theme song, which is super cool. But like that's not the point of it. The point of it is something like more universal and connected to like themes of childhood and adulthood and the world.
Yeah, Tales from the Loop doesn't hit you over the head with the 80s hammer and force you to remember things a certain way through a certain lens. Like, Tales from the Loop is, to me, a much more superior product when it comes to nostalgia because it lets you have your nostalgia.
Yes.
It's not trying to be like, remember this, but this, remember this, and it's this, and you remember this, you remember this, you remember this. It's like, no. What do you remember about the 80s? And that's your experience. So I highly, highly, highly recommend Tales from the Loop to anybody who's into RPGs, especially now in the Discord era of RPGs where we are playing a lot of games from home and a lot of games without people sitting directly next to us. This game will play well over the internet.
Yeah. Also, I love the idea that because you're playing kids, one of the other core pillars is that adults could never help you. They never understand. They could never save the day. It's always going to come down to you solving your own problems, which I think is a cool message.
That's the best. Yeah, that's it.
And something that the Amazon TV show ignored.
And that's something, you know, I don't want to get too far into on this episode. I really just want to focus on the game. However, I do think that was a very big misstep for the actual TV production of it was, kids make it happen.
Exactly.
So you should have relied more on the kids getting the job done.
Yeah. But I bring up the Amazon show less to talk about it and more to just sort of have that underscore the surprising success of Tales from the Loop as like a franchise. It's art books, it's a role-playing game, and it's a TV show. And I think that's overlooked a little bit in terms of like how popular this thing really is. Because, as I always say, D&D sucks up all the oxygen, you know? And it's just like, we got this really great thing that people are really into. And like, you just don't hear about it enough.
Well, it seems like Tales from the Loop is breathing pretty well on its own these days. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Tales from the Loop?
Pick it up and try it. And if you have people in your life, like a wife or parents, I bet you could get them to play this and it would still be fun. Like, I think that this is one of those rare role-playing games that could get everybody around the table, at least for one session. And they'll have a blast. Even if they never play it again, it is a fun game that encourages you to be silly and creative, almost out of hand. It was just amazing to see those non-role players when we played it just like live in this game. It just immediately come alive. It was so cool.
Very cool, Stu. So this was another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posting about role-playing games of all types all the time, every day. Every day, Hambone. You know how much work that is?
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
You text me sometimes, you're like, I only have X amount of posts left to do. And it's a lot. It's always a lot.
So you folks should go out and look at my Instagram because it's a lot of work and I do it for you.
Aw, buddy. You can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. You can also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews do help other listeners to find us if you like the show. And you're looking for some cool extra content, think about sliding over to our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes, we've got videos, we've got a lot of cool bonus content, and a special Discord channel just for the patrons. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.